Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Natalia Kapitnik, Director of Communications at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. I'd like to welcome you all to the 8th episode of our special series, The Continent, where we explore how the war in Ukraine is changing Europe's politics and security. This discussion is being recorded and will be available, along with previous episodes, on our website, www.fpri.org, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and also here on Twitter. So with that, we'll get started, and I'll turn it over to our host, Aaron.
Good morning, afternoon, and evening. Welcome to another live recording of the Continent podcast. On this podcast, I'm learning about how the war in Ukraine is impacting politics, society, and security across Europe. Each episode, I visit, in quotes, one country and learn about the local dynamics of how the war in Ukraine is changing things there. I'm joined by local and regional specialists, and they help me learn. So I'm glad to have you along with me on this learning journey. Now, today is a very special episode, and an episode I've been hoping to do for some time now, because we have talked about a lot of countries where there's a pretty, between countries and within countries, a pretty resolute foreign policy or even domestic policy consensus about the war in Ukraine. A lot of countries in Europe, with some nuances, agree on the general kind of contours of how the response to Russia should be formulated, but not Hungary. Hungary is kind of the bad boy of Europe, if you will, and stands alone, especially on the foreign policy question. So I really wanted to dive into why it explains this difference. So today, to explain the terrible title of this podcast, we're getting stuck in the mire. Stuck in the mire, as in the deep mud and thick of it, but Magyar is in the Hungarian language and the initial group of tribes that came into Europe and settled in Hungary from the Urals. This is not a linguistics podcast, but we'll talk a little bit about Hungarian today. We have some exciting words of the day. So all that said, before I ramble further, I wanted to bid a warm üdvözlök, which I hopefully just welcomes them informally, although they can tell me if I got that wrong, but a warm welcome to our guests, Andras Toth-Czifra and Marta Pardavi. So I want them to start by introducing themselves, their affiliation, and what keeps them busy. Marta, we'll start with you.
Hello and greetings, everybody. I'm Marta Pardavi. I'm the co-chair of a human rights NGO based in Budapest, Hungary. It's called the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. I am based in Budapest right now. That's a coffee machine that you might hear in the back. It's a fall afternoon in Budapest, and this means that things are getting very busy. The Hungarian Helsinki Committee traditionally has been working on refugee protection and criminal justice issues, and also law enforcement and human rights issues for many, many years. But since 2010, we've added a very important focus on the rule of law, looking at how a constitutional framework is under attack in Hungary and advocating for a strong domestic and European response to this democratic backslide.
Fascinating. Thank you for that background. Andras, over to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Andras Toth-Czifra, and I am also Hungarian, though I am based in New York City. Apart from being a political and business risk analyst, I am right now also a non-resident fellow for CEPA, the Center of European Policy Analysis, DC-based think tank. I occasionally write for FPRI as well. And my primary focus has been, for most of my professional life, has been Russia. However, for a while now, I have also been observing professionally and semi-professionally the illiberal experiment that has taken place in Hungary since 2010, earlier as a think tanker as well. And what keeps me busy right now? Well, in New York, we have a slightly less pleasant fall morning, so I am sitting indoors, but probably you can still hear the street noises, so apologies about that, and I'm trying to talk through them.
No worries. We're glad to have both of you joining today. So I wanted to start with a recent piece of news, which some of you listeners may have heard, but if not, I want to say it was a couple of weeks ago that the European Parliament voted essentially that Hungary was no longer a democracy. It was a forget the exact terminology, but a sort of hybrid autocratic democratic framework. I'd like to learn from both of you a little bit about the contours of that illiberal democracy. What does that mean day to day or election to election? So, Marta, I want to turn to you to ask, let's start with the political institutions. What does illiberal democracy mean in practice?
Yeah, what the European Parliament, in a pretty overwhelming majority, decided 2 weeks ago was that Hungary is no longer a democracy, but it's a hybrid regime of an electoral autocracy. And this is, although of course it's a political statement from a political body, but it does have a lot of meaning. And for me, it's actually quite painful to hear this, but I have trouble contesting it. This is the consequence of, I think, well over a decade of democratic backsliding. And as you say, this means that institutions, very important constitutional frameworks, checks and balances are being dismantled over time. And people who follow Hungary a bit, I think, are quite familiar with this path. But over time, the classic three branches of government that should be controlling each other, that should be checks against overbearing power against each other, have been distorted and dismantled in the Hungarian case. So from a liberal democracy where we have these branches of government, each making sure that the other two wouldn't be encroaching on their power, from this we've gone to an illiberal system where actually the executive is the most important and the most powerful, and it has made the other two branches, the legislative and the judicial, pretty subservient. This has been achieved over time, and it has been a very legalistic process in the case of Hungary. So we always have to explain a myriad of laws and their changes and technicalities. This uninitiated ear might make such a technical process, but in fact, this is how in the 21st century, in the middle of Europe, in an EU member state, you can see democracy being dismantled. And so this means that either institutions' roles, their competencies, their powers were changed so that they would become weaker, or their leadership was changed so that the most senior office holders, people in high public offices, would become very loyal to the government. You wouldn't need to expect them to actually start exercising their roles. And also external constraints, such as the media and civil society, have also been weakened to an extent that, of course, you do have independent media in Hungary, and you do have independent civil society organizations and citizens, concerned citizens themselves, but they really can't tilt the balance back, at least for now. So the liberalism, I think, is in the Hungarian case, is a scenario where the constitutional institutions have been captured and they've been made to serve the executive branch of government, and also where citizens themselves are made to feel powerless or apathetic, so that they themselves wouldn't start thinking that they might be able to rectify the distorted landscape.
Thank you for that context. Andras, if you have anything to add or comment on, please do so now. And if not, I have a kind of part two of that question for you.
Just a couple of words, because I completely agree with what Marta just said, and she focused on the institutional side, which I think is the more important, because it tells you how things in Hungary work and why they do not work the same way as if you're just a casual observer of Hungary, you would sometimes expect them to work. What I would add is that a core of the liberal democracy in Hungary is the rejection of pluralism, which, according to the analyst Jan Werner Müller, who wrote a book about populism, is the sort of the core logic of populism itself. So you reject the idea of social pluralism, political pluralism. There's one party, there's one leader that defines himself, or who define themselves as the sole executor and representative of the people's will. And initially, this starts in fairly subtle ways, and then it grows into a situation in which any outside opposition idea can be rejected as either treasonous or is not worth discussing or against the interests of the nation without discussing it on merits. So this has been underpinned in Orban's rhetoric throughout these 12 years with a sort of a constant warlike rhetoric, and he uses expressions such as war, battle, you name it. If you look up any of his major speeches from over the past 12 years, I guarantee you will find something like this. And these metaphors are usually directed at an enemy that is sort of distant and small enough so that they won't be able to mount a serious response, or just unable because too abstract. And they're abstract enough also so that anyone can read anything into the sort of image of the enemy. And this can be then extended to either external critics or internal critics. But I think this logic is the one important thing that I want to add to the sort of the institutional capture that Marta just described.
So we talked about the kind of institutional framework, but I also wanted to ask about the day-to-day of this kind of illiberal democracy. And Marta had mentioned the media. Now, if I remember correctly, I think a few months ago, you did a really, really fascinating project based on, I forgot the news source that did this, but based on a project that showed what an average Russian might see in the media on a day-to-day basis. And you made one that showed what an average Hungarian might see on a day-to-day basis. So if you could you tell me a little bit about the narratives surrounding the Ukraine war or otherwise that are kind of prolific in the in the Hungarian media space?
Yeah, so the project that you mentioned is still available under orban.media if anyone would like to look it up. It was basically a riff off of what The Economist did about, you mentioned, the Russian media space, which, where of course, it's a much more closed and a much more closed media space with a much more pervasive control of the state. So I didn't want to suggest that the Hungarian media is where Russian media is today. However, there are similarities. So in the case of the Hungarian media, but a very important thing that you need to know is that after that, the media has been the focus of Fidesz's sort of attempts to control the internal political discourse from the onset. But between 2010 and 2014, this was sort of an effort that focused on regulation. The media law, a new media law, was one of the first pieces of legislation that were adopted when Orban and Fidesz came to power in 2010. The setup of a new media authority, which was staffed by Orban's appointees. And then in post-2014, when there was a rift in Fidesz itself, which caused the rift in the media associated with the party, the focus shifted onto sort of capturing media through means of money, advertisements, various forms of pressure, but mostly buying them up and sort of changing their editorial view. And as a result, by 2018, when a new foundation was formed where the official owners of Fidesz-friendly media outlets donated their holdings, this media holding oversaw around 80% of news-focused media in Hungary, based on their income statements. This has since likely grown as major media outlets, including the biggest online news outlets, were sort of folded into this Fidesz-friendly media space, which is not just this holding, but this holding makes up a big chunk of it. And the narratives that are broadcast in this holding, which is especially dominant in the print segment and in radio segment, not so much in the internet. So these are very strongly centrally defined and edited. We have had various investigative reports pointing out how this control works. We have had leaked conversations, for instance, from the public broadcaster from before the 2019 European parliamentary elections that suggested that it is expected from the people working for the public media to serve the government's interests. So there are tons of evidence, which I will not go into now, but anyone can look up. My point here is that this media machinery has been essential to sort of maintain the direction of Orban's foreign policy ship, and without sort of rocking the domestic policy boat too much during the war in Ukraine. Because even as Orban initially supported sanctions against Russia because it was expected of the government to do so, his domestic media kept on broadcasting pro-Kremlin viewpoints, and these pro-Kremlin viewpoints have sort of radicalized in the past couple of months. We can talk about that later in more details if you want, but let's just, for now, leave it at this.
Thank you for that context. Marta, as someone in Budapest, as far as these narratives, and I don't want to dedicate this podcast space to voicing the narratives necessarily, but what are the kinds of messages that the government is ostensibly backing or projecting into the kind of public media space and discourse?
I'm sure we have a global audience here, but many people in the US will find familiar as the divisions in society and the very strong polarization in Hungarian society that's also reflected in the media space and on the news people consume or are being spoon-fed. So as a Hungarian who is really interested in current affairs and who has access to the internet, most people of course would, then you can find information online mostly that would give you an understanding of the various viewpoints and also not only the Hungarian government's propaganda position, but if you're not so proactive to seek out information, but rather watch television, for example, or consume print-based news from daily newspapers, then you're very likely to get an extremely one-sided picture of reality, and also of Russia's war in Ukraine, and also the Hungarian position about this. So, as Andras just described, this is almost as if there is a permanent political campaign in Hungary, where the role of an enemy, sometimes fictitious, sometimes artificially fueled, is really important, so that the government and the Prime Minister Orban would be able to position themselves as a defender of the nation. And so just these past few days, when I look through, for example, a very pro-government media outlet that's both in print and also online called Magyar, the Hungarian Nation, which at one time was a very reputable newspaper outlet, most of the headlines on the cover page above the fold, so to say, so until you start scrolling down where there's the basement, most of these headlines will be looking at threats, of course. So leading piece today is how illegal migration is really threatening Hungary, and the situation is, as they say, is becoming dire by the day, and we need to fortify our border protection measures and also work with the Serb and Austrian neighbors of Hungary. Then a lot of headlines about the sanctions, the gas sanctions that Brussels is plotting, that the European Union is trying to basically force down our throats in Hungary, although these are extremely harmful for everybody, including Hungarians. Thankfully, the Hungarian government is willing to resist this kind of harmful initiatives from Brussels by protecting Hungarian citizens and even being willing to veto certain EU measures. So there's a lot of talk about the enemies and also about the threats and also about how the Hungarian government is the sole protector of this nation and how we're basically abandoned. So it's very weird. I think in this polarized space, a lot of people get the idea that Hungary is really on its own. We're in a sea of animosity, and we're being let down by our own alliances. This is a very strong narrative. So Hungary has been a member of both NATO and the European Union for quite a while. But it seems if you consume these kind of news outlets, or propaganda outlets rather, you basically get the idea that they are against us. They're harming our own national citizen interests, and there's nobody else but our government who will protect us. This was a very important part of the political campaign that preceded the general elections on April 3rd.
Interesting context there. I want to ask about the general elections, but I also have a question that's a follow-up from this. So with a lot of this rhetoric, and we'll talk about kind of the contours of this for security and sanctions in a little bit, but with all this rhetoric against European Union, Brussels, and NATO ostensibly, have we seen any rhetoric in favor of leaving those institutions?
Well, if I can come on this, when it comes to the European Union, Hungarians have been quite consistently very supportive of the EU membership. The polls have always shown that over 75% of Hungarians are looking at the EU membership as favorable. Now, this is, of course, if you start digging deeper, quite plausibly related to, for example, very tangible advantages of being a citizen of an EU member state, such as the freedom of movement. You can cross borders, you can move across borders, you can work without work permits, you can freely basically choose where you live in the EU and what you do. And this is very tangible. There's very low wages in Hungary compared to some of the neighboring countries, so people can just move away and already hope to have a significant increase in their standard of living and in their financial situation. But this feeling of being free to move, I think, for maybe not the youngest generation, but those who still remember what it was like to be crossing, for example, into Austria when the Iron Curtain was still up and there was very, very harsh border checks, or you couldn't even travel to the West because there was no such bits from your own country. I think these liberties really evoke a strong emotional feeling of liberty too for a lot of people. But at the same time, Hungarians, I think attitude surveys show, are very fond of their wallets, and they don't want anybody to interfere with them, and really value the financial support, the financial contributions that the EU membership brings with it. So the funding that comes from Brussels. So these two things, the freedom of movement and the financial contributions to prop up or strengthen Hungary's economy, infrastructure, are really important. And I think the voices about leaving the European Union, that it's not really fit, have become a bit stronger, but they're still, I think, absolutely not a majority viewpoint. But it is basically a kindling. So to poll surveys and to tap into what people are thinking and potentially boost those certain sentiments, public feelings against EU membership, that's an option for the Hungarian government, which I think has become really important now.
So both Fidesz and some other political forces, far-right political forces, including politicians from the opposition party Our Homeland, which is an even more radical, or at least in rhetoric, more radical outlet than Fidesz, have been raising every once in a while the prospect of Hungary leaving the European Union. It is not a crystallized policy. I think what we see here is a sort of a testing of waters and sort of throwing this idea out there and seeing how popular it is at any given point, and what the party that throws it out there, typically Fidesz, can get out of it. On the other hand, what Fidesz has been doing, and along with other sort of radical right politicians, is to say that they're not against the European Union per se, but they are against the sort of the globalist agenda of the European Union. Call it the United States of Europe, as some might call it Brussels bureaucrats, as Orban very often calls it. So it's basically a decoupling of the idea of the European Union, which most Hungarians have very favorable views on, and something that is more abstract, that is sort of that sort of elicits less positive feelings, and that people can get angry with.
So I want to ask one more question before we get to my favorite part of these episodes, Word of the Day. So speaking of this last general election, Fidesz won relatively handily, and we'll turn this to you, Andras. How much of that election result was related to skewed political institutions? How much of that is related to Fidesz just being popular? How much of that relates to the opposition of itself? Kind of what was your takeaway from that election?
So I would say that both the institutional changes and this is sort of the failure of the opposition to really construct an agenda and address voters had a role to play, but not to the same extent. So when we talk about the institutional changes, Hungary's electoral system, which was changed in 2012, is a mixed system, as it had been before, but with a crucial difference, namely that 106 parliamentary deputies out of 199 who are elected in single mandate districts are elected according to the first past opposed system, which means that anyone getting a plurality of the vote is elected, which that allows a strong strong governing party maintain an enormous advantage over the opposition in the number of seats, as long as the opposition is divided, even if the governing party does not have a strong majority of the overall vote. And this is what happened in 2014, 2018. In 2022, less so. The votes were actually more reflected a bigger advantage of Fidesz, which is why I'm saying that in this particular case, it's not just the system. We have to acknowledge that this happened after 12 years of Fidesz governance, which included the weakening of the rule of law and various institutions that are also important when we're talking about whether an election is free and fair or can be called free and fair. So when it comes to the opposition for the 2022 election sort of huddled together and they tried to defeat this system by holding primary elections to select the candidate with the most chances to defeat the Fidesz's candidate in each of these single member districts. And in order to make the message, the opposition, more unified and to sort of give it further boost, they also selected a candidate for prime minister who would lead this coalition. That person ended up being a small-town mayor who had a sort of legend behind him, that he himself, as the head of a local opposition coalition, defeated a Fidesz candidate in a Fidesz bastion in southern Hungary in 2018. And to top it off, he was also a self-confessed conservative politician, so it was thought that he would be able to attack on his home turf. But this didn't really turn out to be a case. So the opposition has also some persistent problems with sort of certain personalities who have been built up by Fidesz as political bogeymen. And I'm not only talking about Ferenc Gyurcsány, the former prime minister, who heads the most popular opposition party and who is a controversial figure, but also other personalities who were singled out and through this mighty media machine sort of turned into either weaklings or unreliable or some other kind of negative figure. It was, in a way, a combination of both the system and that the opposition could not rise to the challenge.
I understand. In the interest of time, because I have a question I'm really excited about coming up, we'll move on from this topic. But before we get to that question, let's do our words of the day, if you'd be so kind. Now, Andras, you had one picked. What was your word of the day here?
Okay, so my word of the day, and you can try to say this after me, rezsicsökkentés, which roughly means the household utility price cap, which is a policy that has been one of the cornerstones of Orbán's governance from the very early days on after 2010. It is what it sounds like. It's a utility price cap that has been, that you might be familiar with right now if you live in a European country, because due to the energy crisis, several European governments are now thinking about similar policies, but this has been a consistently sort of touted policy of Orbán, and a very popular policy that they try to hold up ever since they introduced it a decade ago. And the reason why it's interesting is that before the April election, Orbán was specifically asked whether, given the circumstances of the war, the rising energy prices, this would be sustainable. And he sort of said yes, but also gave a vague answer. And then it turned out after the election that it would have to be cut back, and that as a consequence, because it will not surprise you that apart from the energy deals with Russia, a lot of taxpayer money also went into this policy, so that it would be a burden that the Hungarian budget was simply unable to take on for this year, and therefore it would have to cut back. And I think the effects of this cut are still things that are ahead of us, so we haven't really seen all the full effect panning out. But anyway, this is my word of the day.
And Marta, over to you. Do you have a word of the day for us? Andras, I'm going to decline politely to try to pronounce that, with respect to the Hungarian language. But Marta, over to you.
Yeah, too bad, because the Hungarian language, I think, is really beautiful, and rezsicsökkentés contains a lot of the sounds that make it beautiful. But my word is mélypont. Mélypont is basically low point, and it's not as complicated. The reason I picked it, because I think a lot of people these days are feeling that there is a real point in Hungary now, both economically and also politically, and also in terms of prospects, of hope. My personal take on this is that usually when there's a low point, things don't go lower, right? At least we're led to believe. But the reason I picked this word mélypont is because, for example, if you just look at the Hungarian forint slide, superbly rapid weakening against the euro and the dollars, this word crops up quite a lot in people's everyday conversations and also in newspaper articles. The forint has been really sinking against the dollar, against the euro, so much so that today it's €1 is worth, there was a time this morning when it was 426 forints, and about a year ago this was at least 15% less, maybe 20. So a year ago it was about let me see, it was 19% less. So people really feel this. Your money is worth lari, the inflation is really high. Utility prices, the famous rezsicsökkentés policy having to end, are going up. They're not going up gradually, but they're going up really immediately from suppressed utility prices to basically high or real utility prices. This is quite a shock for a lot of Hungarians who are not only unprepared to finance this, but really don't have the means to do this. Another reason why I picked low point is because I think there is a low point when it comes to Hungary's perception in the European Union from its fellow member states, when it comes to not only the rule of law issues, the dismantling of the democracy, the hybrid regime that we spoke about earlier, and the consequences of what this means for EU and European Union unity, but also when it comes to just simply the lack of allies that we seem to be having. So for quite a while, I think the Hungarian position has become very untenable, and there's hardly anyone left to basically take our side, I would say for good reason. Now, the Hungarian government, I think, is very hopeful that with the far right government now in Italy, they have stronger backing, stronger political support. The third reason for this choice of the word is because I think a lot of people who and most Hungarians will be like this, who depend on public services such as education and healthcare, feel that we're really at a low point. And this is perhaps the most painful. It's a protracted governance crisis. For many years, there was a very, very strong support for Mr. Orbán in parliament, a supermajority. You can really push through legislation basically almost overnight. And there was a very favorable economic circumstances. Despite this, there is a decline, a very palpable decline in public healthcare, public education, so much so that now teachers all over the country are going on strike because many of their wages, their monthly salaries are lower than that for cashiers in supermarkets. And in fact, this dissatisfaction of teachers has now started, I think, a quite interesting one-to-watch kind of protest series, and 5 teachers were actually fired for protesting and going on civil disobedience because teachers' right to protest and strike has really been limited. So I think there is we'll see, but maybe a budding political movement of teachers and students and parents, basically, that encompasses quite a lot of people in this country who are really dissatisfied with this low service delivery.
As our last question for the next 10 minutes, one I've been kind of deeply curious about asking, and we'll stick with you for this one, Marta, and then Andras can jump in. But turning to Russia policy, I really see some interesting contrasts here. So we have, back in the 1980s, Hungary was invaded by the Soviet Union, and Hungarians today seem relatively Russia-friendly based on the kind of public polling I've seen, versus, say, Czechia, which was also invaded and remains considerably more anti-Russian or anti-Kremlin, let's say. Meanwhile, Orban himself, and in a grad school class on Eastern European politics, watched this speech, came to prominence as a liberal leader publicly criticizing the local Soviet military presence and saying, go home. And same story, he's now self-professed illiberal leader who has the most ostensibly pro-Kremlin view among EU leaders. So I'm wondering, first, on a personal level, as far as your read is, what does Orban want? What explains this change here?
Yeah, this is an intriguing question, and I can and I do not want to portray myself as an expert on this, but certainly the reason why it's so intriguing is partly because of this 180-degree turn that the Hungarian Prime Minister has taken since his first appearance on the political stage, where he was a very brazen, liberal, outspoken, basically telling that the Russians must leave Hungary. And I think that was a very brave thing to say at the time. Whereas today, you will not hear him call out Russia. You will not see strong statements condemning Russia's invasion, the annexation, and he didn't say anything, as far as I know, about the sham referenda. So if you just scroll through the government website, you won't find strong statements condemning, maybe through the website of the head of state, but certainly these words are not spoken by Orban himself. And of course, everybody remembers he went to Moscow at the beginning of February to what was said publicly was to basically ensure that Hungarians would still have cheap Russian gas flowing that could sustain this energy or utility price cap policy. Well, we now know that none of this was probably true, and it's quite striking what the Hungarian government is willing to do to, I would say, appease Russia. Just a few days ago, there was a European Union proposal that was meant to be put forward in the UN Human Rights Council to support creating what is called a special rapporteurship, a special expert role who would investigate human rights atrocities committed by Russia. Hungary vetoed this position so that the other 26 members of the EU had to go ahead and do their own statements, but there was no joint European Union statement on something that is so fundamental. And it should be so clear that we should have a joint, strong statement and position on this. But alas, the Hungarian government was again one that torpedoed this. So he's, I think, willing to quite away. But I think the admiration is perhaps for the strong man, but it's more focused, it appears, towards the policies of China. This is something that we don't watch as closely because the Chinese influence in Hungary is not as conspicuous, for example, in the media messaging. But Orban, I think, really admires China and its political regime, and certainly many of the things that happen in Hungary reflect both. When I look at, for example, the measures that were meant to harm independent civil society in Hungary, the laws that had been adopted in the past few years, these are carbon copies of the Russian foreign agent law or the Russian anti-gay law criminalizing what is called propaganda. A lot of this was basically adapted and rewritten to be less aggressive, but just as much effective in their chilling effect. But in many other ways, I think the Hungarian government and its senior leadership just want to be pragmatists and don't want to dampen their chances. As Andras said in the beginning of this conversation, the rejection of pluralism is a very important trait of this regime in Hungary. And so in order to stay in the middle, in the all-powerful middle, basically weakening your opponents to the extent possible, You need a lot of money. You need to fill voters' heads with propaganda, and you also need to ensure that there would be some measures where the government's budgetary support is felt in this form of utility price cap. Now, this might be dismantling, but the other half will not, and I think this is partly the reason why the practices, the autocratic practices from Russia, are admired and imported.
Andras, last comment to you, if you have anything to add here.
Yeah, so Marta mentioned China, Orban's sort of admiration for the model of governance in China, which he did speak about. Now, I want to mention someone else, Erdogan, president of Turkey, who is, I think, another European leader whom Orban admires, and Orban is trying to copy in many ways, including this sort of balancing act, or which I'm pretty sure is how it is interpreted internally between various centers of power. Orban himself said in a 2017 speech that Hungary had to exist in the, quote, Berlin-Moscow-Istanbul triangle, by which he really meant that it needs to stay kind of unequal. It needs to keep an equal distance from these three powers. And you will notice that the European Union as an entity does not come up in this triangle, it's Berlin. And as for the sort of the balancing act between Germany and Moscow in this context, that's more or less what I think Orban thinks that he's doing by sort of keeping close to Russia. As Marta mentioned, one of the things that Orban has been saying about his closeness to Russia is that it is necessary to maintain the rezsicsökkentés, to use that beautiful word once again. But then it turned out that this was probably not the case. Hungary has been buying Russian gas for a much more elevated price over at least the past year than Orban and Putin let on. So there is something else in there that I don't want to speculate about, but over the past couple of years, one of the most concerning developments in Hungary-Russia relations that we have seen is the sort of that the security angle of the relationship has been sort of loosened up, in the sense that people with suspicious links got golden visas in Hungary under the government's golden visa program, including people in the family of Sergei Narishkin, the head of the Russian foreign intelligence. Hungary did not expel any Russian diplomats from the country after the February invasion of Ukraine, which means that Russia has now one of the biggest functional embassies in the EU in Hungary. We know that the government purchased the Pegasus software to sort of spy on unidentified people, but some of these people have actually been identified. It's just that the government has not acknowledged the spying on them, which is kind of a practice that we would see in more authoritarian states, including in Russia. So there is the security angle, which makes it, which makes us question what the motivations are, and even if the motivations are not as nefarious as some suggest, what the consequences are of sort of letting our guard down and sort of transactionally allowing access in the field of security in Hungary that a NATO country should not allow. So this is more or less what I wanted to add. If you would like to read more about the details of Orban's relationship with both Germany actually and Russia, I could heartily recommend Direct 36, the Hungarian investigative news site, which did wonderful work on these issues, and their articles are available in English.
Thank you so much to both of our guests today for joining. I certainly learned a lot, and stay tuned for future episodes of the podcast. Thanks to all of you.
Thanks, Aaron, and thank you to Andras and Marta for the great discussion. As a reminder, if you missed any part of the conversation, the recording will be available shortly. And as always, to explore more from F's research, podcasts, and upcoming events, be sure to visit us on www.fpr.org.